so that I can make adjustments in and not have
What's up, Abe? So just finishing up my music class, and then I'm staying here for a little bit, then should I come by? What time are we going to work till? Can I find you?
Would you like an introduction, or you think make sure we're here? I'm just gonna grab her hat.
Yeah, at least answer the question. So like, I'll finish this like 9, 10 o'clock, then work till like 2, I guess?
Yeah, so some words are
Okay, so then tomorrow, yes.
Everybody suddenly got quiet.
There was some ambient noise, so we thought
We're about to start in just a minute. I think they want me to be mic'd up or something like that. But if you're here for the cooking with plantains workshop, you're in the right place.
We're doing like tostones or?
Tostones, pongo, depending.
Oh man, you like a good response here for
I'm just kidding.
Now I can go back to anyone.
All right. Am I using a mic or is my voice in the
If you could, because it's going to go through for the live stream.
Which mic? This mic?
Yeah, let's make sure we're doing
Put it
it.
kind of somewhere.
Yeah, if it doesn't, it's not the most big of a deal.
Testing 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, hello people.
Priority is these guys here right now, not this.
Yeah,
We don't want to blow the other people out of the water in the other class, but
That's my complaint.
We're good. You're good to start whenever.
Okay, so everybody, my name is Abe Duque. I am an instructor here at 343 Labs. I teach a few things, but one of the things that I love to teach is mixing and mastering. I've been involved in production and mixing and mastering for the better part of 3 decades now. Yes, I don't look it, but I'm pretty old. Yeah, so I've been asked to do a little talk on, well, they just said generally mixing and mastering. So, what is this idea of mixing and mastering? So, I thought, well, what angle am I going to take it? I'm just basically the angle is the importance of having some mixing and mastering. So, I remember just before I got into the whole thing, the 80s sometime, wasn't that important. If you were an artist, or even a writer, or producer even, was it important to have mixing and mastering skills? That changed, and it started to change around in the 80s, really, when home studios became a reality. When people started to have, little setups at home, and samplers, and drum machines, and things like house music started to get created, and hip-hop, thank God for sampling all that. But even then, the idea of mixing and mastering was always like, hey, we'll let it to the professionals. And there was this attitude maybe that, the professionals will fix your record. That your job is just to write the record and to just get it down somehow. And then when you get to the mixing engineer, that mixing engineer is going to make it all good. And especially when it gets to mastering, that's when it becomes a real record, right? Well, yeah, that was the attitude. It was the wrong attitude to have even then, but what other choice did we have? We're in another age right now. We're in an age where, well, we're going to have to do everything now. We have to wear all the hats. We have to be the writer, we have to be the producer, we have to be the performer, we have to be the promoter, we have to be the booking agent, we have to be the mixing and mastering engineer at times as well. I mean, there may be a time when you get a luxury situation where you'll have somebody mix and master your record. It's kind of a luxury these days. Now, don't get me wrong. You can go on Fiverr and find for almost nothing somebody to mix your record. And you can go on Lander. You ever hear of this thing, Lander? Yeah. What is it, $6? Get you a master.
Analog digital master.
Yeah.
$7 a month.
Yeah. I mean, you can do that. But that's basically what people get. The amount of knowledge that's out there, it's a little sad, it's a little crazy. I mean, back in the older days, the professionals, went through a rigorous process of like becoming professionals. They interned for a long time before they were even allowed to do anything but bring coffee. And then they were given menial tasks, clean up, set up this, set up that, and maybe one day they could touch a knob on the console. And now these days, is a different story. We're living in a time when everybody knows everything because there's YouTube out there, right? And YouTube is wonderful. I learn things on YouTube all the time. The problem with YouTube is you can be getting really bad information, and all seems very convincing, right? And the amount of bad information that I see is amazing. It really is. It boggles my mind how much I see students walking in to class with information that's not necessarily correct, and even worse than that, just a little wrong, and it guides them down the wrong path. So these days, it's at least imperative to know at least something, at least a little bit about mixing and its counterpart, the mastering part, which I don't like to use that word mastering. I think that word mastering has a connotation of I don't know what. I see a couple of people that were in my mixing class here, and they know that I like to call it what, Nathan? Oh, Nathan, come on, wake up. Master bus treatment. That's what I like to call it. Or even just bus treatment. Because mastering has if I ask this room, what do you guys think mastering is all about? I'm not going to ask, but in the past, most of the time I get this answer that's like making it louder or something like that, right? Which to me it's very sad because making it louder. Well, anyway, let's move on. So, okay, I got some notes that I wrote here. I'm going to read a little bit from my notes and then expand on it, and I'll take some questions as time goes by. So, yeah, first point I had is proper mixing and mastering is hard to come by. So, learn it. It's not that hard to learn some basic principles. If you really, even if you just learn the science of sound, I mean, this stuff helps you so much in just making the right decisions early on in the process. See, most of the time when I get a mix, somebody sends me a mix, or especially a master, I see it as a total situation of damage control because I'm thinking I have to undo all these bad things that were done during the mix because, nobody knew what they were doing about certain aspects, which makes it a lot harder for a mixing engineer, but also, makes it so that the track can sound a lot better at that point when it comes to me. Like, it is totally possible, if you're a mastering engineer, it is totally possible to get a mixed record for you to master that is so well mixed that mastering is not at all necessary. Just a little bit of treatment here and there, making sure it's optimized or whatever, but the idea of using a multi-band compressor or the OTT or whatever kids like using these days and things of this sort to try, all that stuff doesn't have to happen. Now, how many times have I seen that? Maybe twice in my whole career that a record has come to me that's so well mixed that I don't have to touch it. Most of the time I have to go in there, and most of the work that I have to do is really damage control. It's fixing, and mastering could be the last ditch effort at getting the record to sound anything but horrible. All right, so do we need somebody to master your record or mix your record? It's nice. I mean, one of the arguments that's been made across time, I've always heard it, is that it's always great to get another set of ears on your stuff. That's true, I suppose. It depends on who it is. At this point, I also realize that another set of ears could actually be the wrong thing to have. It's not easy to line up the right set of ears. And so when you're looking for somebody to mix or master your record, make sure you get that right set of ears. And what do I mean by that? Well, I knew a guy who was a friend of mine. He was really happy because he had found out that his girlfriend's uncle was a mastering engineer for Sony and had been mastering 30 years for Sony. And he made dance music, and he had asked him, hey, could you master some of my records? And he was like, of course, nephew. So, you know, he was ecstatic. He thought this was, you know, an amazing fight. So he goes and gets over there and gets some work done with the guy. And then I meet him, you know, sometime later, and I ask him, hey, how did it go? And he's like, well, not so well. And I said, well, what happened? Well, it turns out the mastering engineer had been mastering classical music for 30 years, which is, you know, a totally different genre, and I had no idea about how to treat dance music at all. So even when you get people that know how to treat dance music, maybe are they necessarily going to, you know, adhere to your vision? And that's the hard part. And you know, better that you take everything you can to learn these days, because learning is what you can do best these days, and learn about some of the skills that can make your mixes while you're producing much better. Because it's much better to get these things done as you're writing the song. It also motivates you because it sounds really good as you work it. All right, so it's really important to understand the science of sound. What do I mean by that? Well, how the physics of sound work. Like, if I ask somebody in the room, I'm going to ask, what is sound? Anybody?
Frequency.
Oh, wait a second. You raise your hand faster.
It's an electrical impulse.
It's a what?
An electrical impulse pushed through a waveform and comes out of your speakers, and you can put effects on it afterwards.
Well, that is what sound out of the speakers, one way of creating sound out of speakers, but sound exists in nature.
Frequency?
Okay. Part of the components of sound is the frequency, yes, sir.
Vibrations in the air.
Okay, vibrations in the air. Okay, so air vibrates as a source. It creates you know, some hubbub, and the vibrations come out in the air. And then, is that the end of the story? No, because sound needs you to complete the whole picture. Sound doesn't exist without you. So the idea is there's a tree falling in the forest, and there's no body or animal or intelligence to hear it. Does it exist? It doesn't exist, because you have to. Sound is totally a human thing, and well, all other animals that can perceive sound as well. But the way that we talk about sound and what we mean when we say sound is totally a human thing. So we need to, like, what happens is these vibrations, they come and they get to your ear, where there's like all this little sensitive instrumentation that senses the vibrations and realizes what frequencies we're talking about, and then your brain makes a whole kind of computation as to what is happening, and things like the law of first wavefront come into play, which you don't think about, which is the Haas effect. Have you ever heard of the Haas effect? Which is if something hits this ear a little bit before this ear, then your brain kind of attributes this presence whole thing to it. So sound doesn't just happen from a vibration in the air. Sound happens, the whole idea of sound finishes when you actually qualify it and actually observe it. Okay? So understanding how that happens, understanding, you know, what your frequencies are. So there's a few things that we can maybe touch upon here. I urge you, you know, we got an hour and a half. You know, there's no way I could teach you how to be an awesome mixing and mastering engineer in an hour and a half. There's nothing I can do about that. But I can try to point you in the right direction. So I got some things written down here that kind of, you know, make me feel like you should maybe be looking towards these things. So your frequency neighborhoods, what I mean by that is, well, what I mean frequency, I mean how fast the sound appears, the frequency, the wave. We measure that in something called hertz. A hertz is a cycle per second. And if something cycles, let's say 20 hertz per second, we should be able to somehow perceive it, right? Anybody know the top end on that one? So the low end, that's the low frequency. Top end on that one?
20,000.
20,000, but how many parties have you been to? Because you've been to a lot of parties, that's not the same. Probably changed, probably something around 16 or something like that. So 20 to 20,000, and the lower part of that to 20 part of that, you don't really hear with your ears, you feel it with your body. So you hear like a person, deaf people sit on a speaker or touch, feel the music. It's because they feel it with their body. You know, some speakers, a lot of the speakers that you have or headphones that you have don't even go down that low. All right, so understanding all this and how this, all the mechanics of all this stuff is the first step towards understanding what's going on in your mixes. And then while you're writing things, I mean, I should hope I shouldn't even say this, but your tuning should be, you know, kind of there. I mean, if you're writing music and you know how to play in key or whatever, that's fine. But what I mean by tuning is like, if you have kick drums, a lot of the time, especially if you're using like 808 style kick drums, so like big kick drums with a lot of, with actually they carry a note, you should be taking these kick drums and tuning them to your record, so they become a little more harmonic with what you're doing. So these type of things, and I mean, there's tons of examples of what I mean by this that I can't really get into because I have a whole list of a million things that I want to get into. But these type of things are things that you need to consider and start to look at. And these are the things that I find that, you know, I've been teaching here for about 6 months now, and before that I taught at this place called Dubspot, and it just surprises me every time when students come into the mixing class that they might be very accomplished writers and producers, and they might have amazing music to present, but the type of knowledge they have about mixing and mastering is usually like none to what they should be having. I mean, they have some, they have heard some things, they try to apply some things, but nothing that, and if they have had, you know, everybody at the end of the course, everybody is always like, oh my goodness, I see things different now, and it changes the way they write music, it changes the way they lay out their songs. So please look into this. Okay, so all right, just test you guys a little bit. What frequencies carry the most energy?
Anywhere between 700 and 5,000.
What did you say?
High frequency.
High frequencies? No frequencies. The lower the frequency, the more energy it takes to push that. And because of that, we tend to like have to consider what's going on in the low end in our music. A lot of times you guys are writing plenty of parts into your tracks, and what you end up with is like all this low end frequency stuff that you can't even use. One of my favorite devices I use Ableton a lot. I use also Big Wig, and I pretty much use everything, but you know, DAWs, Ableton I like because it has a nice complement of effects. Ableton has a nice spectrum analyzer. It's probably my favorite of all the plugins or the devices. It doesn't do anything to your sound, but it tells you what's up. And when you're listening to your sound or you're looking, you really can't tell what's going on in the sound, in the really deep, below the audible range. And plenty of time, even in things as innocuous as like a hi-hat, there'll be like all this sub living there, like just there. And you let it go, and you let it sum up in your mix with all your other parts. I had a student that had a mix that we did an intensive last week, and his typical number of tracks inside of his songs or his projects was like at least 100, and he's had as many as 200. Okay, lots of time in his hands, teenager. Don't think he has a job. But the point is, now imagine 100 tracks, or even half of that, 50 tracks, and you got these many tracks, and you have now some elements carrying some low frequency stuff like hi-hats or this vocal over here that wasn't treated, and now all this low end stuff that you can't hear but carries a lot of energy now has to be carried in the whole mix, and then what happens? It bogs down in your whole mix. And you're like, why are mixes so muddy? Why are my mixes not as loud as that person's mix? Well, it's one of the reasons. It's definitely one of the reasons. So understanding things of this sort, understanding what happens with your frequencies down there, that's a big deal. All right, let me just get through this list. So yeah, the sound that you can't hear, it carries the most energy, which is the low frequencies, like below 20 hertz. And for that, we use a tool like maybe a filter to cut it out. There are considerations to whether to do it or not, depending on the style of the music that you make. And the rule is, the more sparse the music is, the less you worry about the stuff on the low end. So if you were mixing a jazz trio, three instruments, piano, upright bass, and maybe a hi-hat and a snare, right? If you were mixing that down, you have like 4 or 5 elements all together. You really wouldn't worry about like cutting out all the low end, because with such sparse elements, you're going to get a situation where now you'll notice that you've rolled off all that low end because it'll feel less organic. So in those situations, you really don't want to do that. But moving to the other side, to the kid that I was talking to you about last week, who had over 100 tracks per project, you really are playing a game of like, you're managing an energy economy is what you're doing at this point. You're trying to figure out how to like keep this economy in rolling and productive and sounding loud and strong. And one of the ways of doing that is by making sure that the low end is under control. Okay, moving on. So there are also some forbidden frequencies. Forbidden frequencies. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Forbidden frequencies. Nathan, I'm gonna try you out again. Forbidden frequencies, Nathan.
I was off duty.
Oh God.
The forbidden frequencies between 7 and 11.
Okay, he says between 7 and 11. Yes.
11 hertz.
7,000 and 11,000 hertz. 7K to 11,000 hertz. So 7,000 to 11,000. All right, let's start there. What lives around that area? Anybody know?
Symbols.
Who said that?
Symbols.
Yeah, sibilants. What's sibilants? Well, it's you best can describe it by you get a singer gets on the microphone and does this recording, and when you play it back, you can't listen to it because the S's are so pronounced they're driving you nuts. Okay, this is sibilants. We hate sibilants as humans. We can't stand it. It just drives us crazy. Yeah. Oh, you hate it.
No, I'm just kidding.
All right, so you're not doing like that. So we hate sibilants. Sibilants really gets us going. It just. And sibilants, we take care of that in the vocals, but believe it or not, we have to watch out that we don't have sibilants or frequencies of that in that area that are pronounced. With many things, hi-hats are a big contribution to sibilants in your mixes. Almost anything, things that you might not even know. Snares, for example, snares are one of the most amazing elements in your mixes because they cover the whole spectrum. Snare goes all the way to the air, 16K, and all the way down to the subs. So snare can have sibilants in it. And why do we want to avoid sibilants? Well, it just hurts. It hurts your ears. So you might not even be needing to have a singer to be able to be hurt by sibilants. So have you ever been in a really amazing sound system area, like a venue with I was at this place called Public Records the other day. Amazing sound system. Wow, you could just stand there and it's so loud. You could talk to somebody and be like, hey, just have a conversation. You didn't feel like you had to leave. You didn't feel like anything would bother you. Well, it's because one of the reasons is because they take care of the sibilants and they make sure that that's out of there. Because if that sibilants is carried in your mix, it's going to be hard to listen to that loud. Okay, so sibilants. So what we use to get out the sibilants? Anybody know? It's a device that's been created just for that. Yeah. It's called a de-esser. It's called a de-esser, and it means get the S's out. That's just the name of how they came up with the name for that. The other thing, let's go on. In the high-end things, in the importance of air is also. Anybody know where air begins? Air. It's part of the frequency spectrum, and it has a category, and we call it air. And it begins at around 16K, 16,000, where you can't hear it. Sometimes it's hard to notice, but you can definitely notice when it's not there. Air is amazing. Air is great, and we want it in our mixes. So anybody that tells you that they roll off all the air on all their mixes, I don't understand why they would be mixing a record. Again, I can't go deeply into these things. I'm just going to cover like just the framework of all this stuff. Okay, there are also frequencies that appear in your mixes that can be called boxy or I don't know, wonky, or whatever. You should always look around the 200 hertz area and just have a little bell filter and just pop it up and then start kind of pendulum or doing like a pendulum and going back and forth and finding the wonkiness around 200 hertz. It's not always exactly around 200 hertz, but it could be 188 or 207. Doesn't matter. It could be somewhere around that. And you get this this kind of boxiness that is uncomfortable to listen to, and you should be addressing that. You should be like, I don't like. And then once you find it, you do the reverse and you pull it down and you make a little notch, or just cut it out a bit. And you'll find that if you start finding these frequencies, your mixes will just pop up, and suddenly all these other elements will be able to come out and play, and you'll be able to hear things, and it won't be like holding things back. So I'd say anywhere, this area happens around between 100 and 400 hertz, but mostly I start around 200. And I'd say you always kind of find something around 200. Right, Nathan?
Yes.
You're my yes man.
And you can see all that in this spectrum analyzer?
Yeah, well, let me throw a mix in there. Might as well, right? So I've been playing around with this Eurorack stuff lately. And what it is they're just like DAW-less gear, just full of all sorts of frequencies and bad things that you might not want in here. I think I put a folder, yeah, there it is, with some of the recordings that I've been just messing around. This is just like this week. I was just messing around and just putting some stuff together. And oh yeah, shoot, this mouse, this pad really drives me crazy. So I'm gonna drop up. Just give me a second here. I'm so organized. I'm going to drop this, something from this folder in here. Let's take this mix and just drop it in there. Now this is, this is totally unmixed material. It's just material that has just been, recorded without too much consideration. There's no computer involved, so it's just the raw gear, And you can't get any more raw than that. So let's see if we can get some sound going here. Where's Thomas? Is Thomas now? The sound is not working. Could you find Thomas? And meanwhile, we'll just keep on talking about this. So while I have this going, I can get the sound going. Sound card should be playing. Oh, there we go. All right, so let's have a look then under a spectrum analyzer at what's going on with this thing. And here we have our frequency spectrum. And you can see there's not many hi-hats going on in this track. So that's represented down here because the high end is just kind of low here. There's all this low stuff happening. And the way that you look at a frequency spectrum, it's set up in a logarithmic way. So it's a log-base 10 that we're talking about. So basically, 20 hertz line is right here. This is where you're not supposed to be able to hear or perceive the sound. But if you move and you jump from here to here, that's 100 hertz. And from here to here is 1,000 hertz. And from here to here is 10K. And from here to here is 20K. So here about 20, a little bit change, 22,000 hertz is what we can look at here. The reason it's logarithmic this way is because it needs to be, because just the way that the whole, Pythagoras set up this really nifty kind of set of ratios for us to have octaves and musical notes with our harmonic series, and it always is kind of exponentially multiplying. So the lower stuff needs to be, go from one octave, from 20, let's say the note is at 20, to go to the next octave would be 40, because it's always doubling. And then to the next octave is 80, and the next octave is 116. So by the time you get 5 octaves up, you're pretty high. That's why the exponential nature of this setup. But have a look at what's going on over here. Look at this. Garbage. There's a lot of garbage down here. This stuff is just not useful. So I'm going to grab a filter. This will help me out with this situation. So I love these fat filters. They're just probably my favorite ever. The price is right, and it's and it also has a spectrum built into it. So we can look at the spectrum inside of this. Let's take a low cut filter, and let's take a pattern that's pretty steep, not the steepest ever. But what we're doing is effectively cutting out everything, or trying to cut out as much as we can from this, on this side of the filter. Everything inside of it gets the pass. Right now we have it set to 17 hertz. We can move it all the way up to 20 hertz. And I'm going to show you that we have relieved the curve. The curve is not going to absolutely relieve. I mean, I could make it a steeper curve. We can go to like a 96 dB per octave cut. But, that's, but the idea is, and so the spectrum should be on this side. So, you can see now the relief that you get on the bottom end. And now let's listen. Let's turn off the filter and tell me how much the difference was audibly. Not much, right? If any. So we win. We win on this one already. So this little thing is part of the whole thing that I drilled into my students' heads about the order of operations that we need to get done. And one of the first things that we have to do is what, Nathan?
How below 20 hertz? Reductive EQ.
Thank you. Okay, reductive EQ. And reductive EQ, one of the first things we're going to do is reduce all the low end that we don't need. And the other thing that we can start approaching is getting those wonky frequencies that I spoke about. Let's get this moving online here. And maybe what I do is I grab one of these patterns, I cue it up a bit, and then take this up, and then search. And you see, right exactly around 200, right there, some kind of boxy, weird pressure that doesn't really feel nice. So what I'll do then is just take that down. And you want to do narrow cuts and wide boosts. That's the mantra, narrow cuts, wide boosts. So you just basically cut out. But doing that already, and I bet you that's not the only one. If I keep on searching around here, there's probably another one or two that I can identify. It's hard not being in front of the speakers and doing this, by the way. But you get the idea. And once we do get that identified and we pull these down and out of the way, oh wow, our mix suddenly starts sounding a lot better. So these are things we need to be doing, both in our whole mixes, and this is bus treatment. This is already mastering, right? Bus treatment. But it also would be the case inside of all your tracks that you're working on, low end especially, but things like hi-hats and things like all sorts of things that carry frequencies that you don't want. All right, let's keep going through my list. So you have a couple of tools as a mixing engineer that are your go-to tools. A couple of tools are your main go-to tools. And not many, but you got to get to know them well. And I was going to try Nathan again, but I'm a little bit afraid. So I'm not going to try Nathan. But anybody want to be Nathan and tell me what the two tools as a mixing engineer? Oh, go ahead, Thomas.
Just take a wild guess.
Wild guess. Compressor's one of them, and you already used the other one.
EQ?
EQ and compression are the two main things. And getting to know an EQ and the compressor is a very important thing because a lot of people don't understand them. You'd be surprised how little you know about EQ. In EQ, you should know that, for example, if you took like something basic, are you Ableton users in the house? Ableton users, okay, a lot of Ableton users. So let's take Ableton's EQ, which is a kind of a, kind of a pretty standard EQ. So let's, it's the EQ8. Just throw it in here. I have an EQ in there already, but just trying to kind of show this. Can you guys see it? So it has 8 instances of all these tools that you could pick, right? You need to be familiar with all the tools and what they do. And, you have a few of them here. And also to know that, for example, you have some EQ, but you also have some filtering in here. And filters are not EQs. Filters and EQs live together in what you call an EQ, but a filter and an EQ are not the same thing. Anybody know the difference between a filter and an EQ? Go for it.
The EQ will reduce, the filter will remove.
So, say again?
The EQ will reduce, but the filter will remove.
The filter will remove, but the EQ will reduce, so you're not wrong. I wish I would have a little more of an answer. Anybody else? Yep.
Like EQ is usually additive.
Can be additive, yes. So the idea, the difference between them just, but get to the point here. The difference is really the EQ is a function of amplitude, and filter, EQ is a function of amplitude, and the filter is a function of phase. So when you're like getting rid of stuff with a low pass filter or a high pass filter, you're basically phasing out material. You're not, you're not lowering it. And sometimes filters are what you need. Sometimes filters are not what you need. Sometimes, we talked about reducing the low end. In this first example I went for that filter. But if this was a trap track with like 5 elements or, maximum 8 elements, I'd probably be very wary of dropping such a very steep filter on the low end because I'd be afraid of like killing that rumble. You want that rumble. So, with a trap track, either you're boosting it or you're using another type of tool, which is a shelf. Anybody know what a shelf is? You've been using shelves all your life. The other day I said that, people laughed. I didn't understand why. They thought I was meaning shelves, but it wasn't. And you have been using shelves all your life, and I'm actually pulling up now a low and a high shelf. These things are what you see in your parents' hi-fi stereo or your car stereo where it says bass and treble. Those are shelves. Those are shelves. They're just set up at a certain frequency, and everything from that point down gets pushed, and everything from this point up gets pushed. These are shelves, and they're very nice to use even today. So for removing high or adding a little bit of brightness, a shelf might be a better answer than a filter. And the same thing goes for the filters on the low end and versus the shelves on the low end. The question is knowing when. That's the thing we need to figure out. And then, there's EQ, and then there's EQ. And what do I mean by that? Because there's compressors, and there's also a compressor. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are what you want to say maybe modern compressors and modern EQs, what you might call transparent and surgical, going for the job, trying to do exactly what you set it out to do. And then you have vintage stuff. Vintage stuff is stuff that's been made years ago and has been modeled into software. And why is that important? Anybody? Anybody? No? Yeah.
Is that the vintage stuff is going to have a characteristic or a color that's kind of musical, makes it sound good in a certain way?
Damn, you're smooth. Yes, that's the case. It is adding some coloring, some, I don't know, let's call it harmonics, is what really it's all about. It's a harmonic signature and a sequence of harmonics. Frequencies get added on to whatever you have there. They come in 2 flavors, odd and even. Odd being your musical notes, and even being your octaves. And different types of devices focus more on odd or even harmonics. Like if you had tape saturation, saturation is another word that refers to coloring and that stuff, which is all about harmonics, which is all distortion. Tape saturation adds musical notes and is very musical sounding. So it's the odd harmonics. The other type of the other side of the coin on that one would be like tube saturation. Tube saturation adds the octaves, so it makes it a fuller sound. So none of these are exclusively, either even or odd harmonics, but they definitely come in variations of these flavors. And most of the time, whether it's tape or tube, it would have like a highly, musical or highly filling with all the nice octaves you can get from that. So a lot of times when I'm grabbing an EQ, I'm having that thought in mind. Am I, looking to give it some je ne sais quoi, or am I just trying to do a surgical job that I need a samurai sword for? That's the idea. And the same thing goes for compression. The compression goes. These days you have very modern compressors that are super transparent, but my favorite compressors, and maybe what I use mostly now, is the vintage compressors. Because the compressors from the modern compressors, they sort of lost their role. So everybody has been indoctrinated. If you guys have been making music for a while, you guys have been indoctrinated about what a compressor is and what it does and how you use it, right? And what people might say is, if you like boil it all down, they might say, well, it's a way to manage your dynamics, to make sure that things don't get too high or too low and make it a little more even, right? Or as a way to like create some sound design in your transients, right? Like make your kicks or your snares snap a little more, or like maybe the body of that transient the body of that percussive element to come out more, right? That was the case some years ago because that was the only thing that was around. But since then, there have been so many different tools that have come out that have made it so much more, it's so much more interesting now to grab something else, for example, a transient shaper versus a compressor to do the job of transient shaping, because it gets right to the point. So you can grab a compressor and say, well, let's do the classical transient shaping with it. It's not as to the point as a transient shaper is. And if you want to talk about like maybe riding the levels and making, back in the day, I hate that saying, but you would have an elf sitting on your console that would, as you record it to magnetic tape, would ride the level, so that if somebody was singing too loud, they would, ride that level, ride that fader. And that was a way to kind of ameliorate the whole compression action and give it less to do. But people still think to this day that compressing is the way to kind of get that going. But you have plugins like Vocal Rider. Anybody know about this Vocal Rider thing? And many other plugins that are just like that. Vocal Rider. So you could keep going. And people say, well, the compressor's great. What do I do side chaining with? Right? Side chaining. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Well, what about LFO Tool or Shaperbox? These new kind of modern plugins that are actually more to the point and more exact and more, you guys get the picture. So what am I saying? You guys got to reevaluate what a compressor really means. And these days, to me, a compressor, the value of a compressor is more in its vintage qualities than anything else. In the gluing or the gooiness that it can add, or all sorts of things. So that's my compression EQ talk. I mean, I can go on for weeks talking about that, but how much time do we have? We're moving on. So there should be an order of operations about how to get things done, the things that you need to where does it all begin when you have a mix? Where does the mix down actually begin? Where does the mix down actually begin? Well, anybody? Yeah.
I always love the kick first and go from there.
Okay, so you're describing the process of getting to a mix down. But what I meant was that in our productions, where does it begin if we're trying to...
Sense? Buses and sense?
Buses and sense, all nice, same thing. What I mean to say is that you guys are not cooperating. You're supposed to say that it begins when you start writing the music. then when you start laying down a bass line, or when you start laying down your kicks, you start processing them in a way that kind of just starts to make it all, facilitate the whole mixing process so that later on it's just, you know, less to do. And while you're writing, it gets a little more motivating to listen to this music because it sounds so good already. It kind of gives you a bump in, like, you know, motivation. It gives you a bump in, like, and feeling like going on. Inspiration gets, you know, that gets risen. So it starts when you begin. Now, if you're mixing for somebody else, then it starts whenever you hand it that mix. So if you're an engineer and you just have that given to you, then you just got to deal with it. And then what is the first thing you do? You listen to the track and you do a little bit of triage and think, okay, what's wrong with this mix? What am I going to have to fix first? Okay, and then, you know, forget about gain staging and all that. First, you know, just identify all the problems with it. A very important thing to have if you're mixing for other people, and also if you're mixing for yourself, especially in the beginning until you're super confident, is reference tracks. Can't state how important reference tracks are to having your mix work out for you. Identifying tracks that you know work well, not only in your studio, but in the club, in the car, at Granny's house, in the Bose wave radio, and all that. In every single place, it has a good sound. This track is a good reference to what I want my tracks to sound like, because it's also kind of in the same genre. It uses kind of the same instruments that I use. It is as sparse as I like to make it, or as populated as I like to make my tracks. And now this is a good candidate for me to play in my studio and listen together with that mix that I'm about to mix. So if you guys are doing mixes for other people, do not let them make you begin before you get some reference tracks out of them, because you got to get into their head, because most of the time they want that to be exactly sounding like that reference track, even if their mix is pathetically far away. So you just need to see what it is that they want. A lot of the times what they want, if you're mixing with somebody else, a lot of times what they want and what you're going to deliver might be two different things if you do it the wrong way, which is the right way. What do I mean by that? If you go about doing the things that sound right and good, you might lose with the client because they might not want that. They might want something else. So you got to get into their head and know exactly what they're looking for and then deliver on that. Because doing more than a couple of revisions, that's your time right there. Anyway, so the order operations, just getting your listening, triaging, then moving on to a reference track, comparing it to the reference track, having the reference track in that DAW at a ready and able to, you can map a key so that you can switch between the track and your reference track. All good. Even with your own stuff, a reference track is not a bad idea, unless you're that good or been doing it for that long that you know everything and how it should sound, and that's that's on you. Mixing with fresh ears is an important thing, so you can't be like writing all night and say, well, now I'm going to start my mix at 4 in the morning. It's kind of a dumb thing unless you have a gun to your head and you need to finish it because deadlines, at 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay, that's another story. I've been in that situation, and you just do what you have to do. But the idea is that fresh ears go a long way. Mixing as quiet as possible. Also, when I was younger, I used to mix so loud. I wanted big loudspeakers in my studio so that I can pump it and make it feel like I was in the club. This was my what got me going. But these days I've come to realize that that is just the wrong way to go. You need to mix as low and as quiet as you can take it, and perhaps you'll raise it up a little bit as time goes on, as you keep on moving through the process. But you start as low and as quiet as you can, and you wouldn't believe how much information you can get out of a mix when you play it as quiet as you possibly can, like a mouse. Because then you could hear, like it's so funny. I do it all the time in class when people come in. I'm like, all right, let's listen to the mix now, but let's listen to it as quiet as possible. And then suddenly, all you hear is a clap. And then you realize, yeah, okay, the clap had to go down, right? And you wouldn't have immediately said that if you had been listening at a higher level. If you had been like just pumping it, because that's the worst thing you could do. The studios have these speakers that they call mains, the big speakers. Those are the ones, you know, go. And every engineer will tell you, mains in the studio are just to impress clients. So when they come in, they feel like, yeah, we're having a hip hop party in here, you know, pass whatever, and let's, you know, keep going. But the truth is, they're really not that useful for mixing. They're really not that useful. Maybe at one point, just to feel the pressure and how it would feel in a bump in a club, yeah, of course that. But like getting all those levels right, not really going to happen with mains. They're going to happen with smaller speakers and very quiet listening. Even things like speakers like Oratones or Avatones they have now, kind of clones to the Oratones. I like to mix on NS10s. I have a pair of NS10s that I use. They are the worst sounding speakers I own. I hate the way they sound. They're not really, well, I don't hate the way they sound because they do really give you useful information, but I don't listen to them to enjoy music. Like, oh, let's listen to the Dark Side of the Moon on this and just like chill out and like, no, it's really not the speaker to do that in, but it is the speaker that will tell you where all the things are wrong rather quickly. So which brings me to your mixing environment. You need to be mixing in a place that you understand, a place that you know. You know, it's like a relationship, I like to think. You have to form a relationship with the room that you're in, with the speakers that you're using. Does it have to be a gazillion-dollar set of speakers? No. Does it have to be, you know, even less than that? Yeah, it could be whatever you could get your hands on. One situation, I was mixing on some okay speakers, and I used to go master at this place called Europa Disc here in the city. And my friend, you know, we had a workflow. We'd go in there, he's the engineer, he would do some things, he'd turn to me, he'd be like, what are we doing? And I'd be like, all right, come on, roll off this and do that. And it was like amazing, we were like a team. And then he left Europa Disc because I think Europa Disc closed, and he went to a place called Master Disc. And he's like, yeah, you gotta come here, it's amazing. It's the best studio ever. And you could, so I went there and went to cut a record. And it was the best studio ever. It was like, I had never seen anything or heard anything like this. The setup was like the most most amazing, super expensive setup I've ever been in. And then he started the whole, you know, action of like, you know, starting to get the track ready to cut it, because we cutting vinyl there. And he's like, so what do you think? What are we doing? And I'm like, I don't know. Why? Because I had never been there before. I had never been in this super amazing studio with all the amazing, super expensive equipment. I had no relationship to it. I had no, maybe if I had spent a month in there, I would have been like, oh yeah, now I can tell you what to do. But no, I think at that time, my cheaper setup, my cheaper home setup was way more useful to me for my decision-making process. So if you buy a fancy new pair of speakers, don't throw out your old speakers. Because if you've been using them for like 3 years, I don't care if they're like hi-fi speakers or whatever, bookshelf speakers, whatever you've been using, those speakers, you've built a relationship to them, and you have something. There's some important information those speakers can still tell you. On that first day where those new shiny monitors come in, which you spent, you know, a few $1,000s on or whatever, come in and you install them, on that day, those old speakers will still be more valuable to you than those new speakers. The new speakers will sound better, but you won't know how to like get around what they're trying to tell you. All right? And to that note, try to set up more than one listening environment at home. So if you have one set of speakers, that's cool, but imagine you could switch to another set of speakers, maybe your old crappy speakers. Oh my goodness, suddenly you have...
What about speakers as opposed to headphones? Like,
that's my next point. What are you, a mind reader? Yeah, exactly. So let's go right there. Headphones. I know a lot of people say, I mix on headphones, I do everything on headphones. Yeah, it's possible to get most everything done in headphones, especially a good pair of headphones, especially if you don't have the luxury of having a place where you can play a lot of music. But there's a little bit of a danger with mixing in headphones. And let's see, extra credit. Who knows the danger of mixing in headphones?
Your ears?
Well, that's a danger, but it's not the one that I was thinking. Yeah.
The sound is vibrating through the air, so when anyone listens to it not on headphones, you don't hear how it's going to interact with the walls or...
That's an amazing point. So this setup with two speakers here, right? This is a totally different setup than what you have with two speakers right pressed up against your ear, right? So that's pretty different already. So it's another listening experience altogether. But then there's the next thing, which is the danger, which is there's a thing called phasing that occurs in the real world. And what happens is if there's information on the left side and on the right side, they're a little bit off in time. You know, the waveforms, the trough and the peak, they will get out of alignment and out of phase, and they will, if they're the exactly same material, they will cancel out. And then you'll have mixes that just don't, work out. That happened to a student of mine, came in when I was teaching at Dubspot, came in, he was like, they let me work at this amazing studio, I'm gonna bring in this track and blow everybody away. I was like, okay, come on in. Put it in there, we were in a really bad room there. And the phase cancellation that happened in that room, because of just the geometry of the room, made all his low end disappear. And he was pulling his hair out, not understanding what had happened. This would never happen to you in headphones. Why? Because your head is in between the two speakers. There is no chance that these two speakers can meet and cause this cancellation. So when you have a speaker that's in here and one that's in here, the waveforms come out, they meet, they cancel, and then you don't hear anything anymore. When you have these two speakers on the two sides of your head, you hear everything, and you think everything's good. So that's the danger of mixing in headphones. If you could deal with that, then you go a long way to be able to deal with just mixing in headphones. Yeah.
Yeah, but not everyone has the luxury of production of mixing in an acoustically treated room.
Yeah.
That specifically because.
Yeah.
So which ones would be more accurate? Would the headphones be more accurate then?
You can get super accurate with a good pair of headphones, especially if you get to know them. But you don't need an acoustically perfect room. There is no such thing. There's no such thing as an acoustically perfect room. Now, you could also, you could help your room out a little bit. If you have a room that's made out of, like if your studio is inside of a racquetball court, okay, that's not going to work out. You're going to have to find a way to cancel, make those deaden out those reflections, those high frequency and mid reflections, right? The same thing goes for low end. If you're low end, you get this thing called standing waves happen in your room, and you're standing here, you can't hear a bass, and you stand over here, and you hear the bass full on. Well, you're going to have to figure out how to change the geometry in your room so that that kind of works out, at least for where you're sitting and where you're working, right? But the truth is, there's no such thing as a perfect room. Even the perfect rooms are too perfect because there's nobody listening to music in this type of perfect room anyway, right? So what does it mean? Well, I think better to think about is a collection of different listening environments where you test out and you get information from all those environments and make a call on whether this mix is ready to go or not. That's the only thing you can really do. Even if you don't have if you have a decent room or not so decent room, you got headphones, you can go to the car, ask your friend to give you a ride. That's an amazing place. You could visit grandma and then put it on her Bose radio. You could go to a friend's studio. Just try it out in a bunch of different boombox, whatever you can to change it up is what I like to say. Okay, so when thinking of a mix, there's so many things to consider. I mean, I'm talking like I'm parched right now, talking like as fast as I can to try to give you guys as much information as I can. Right? About an hour is going by of me talking, but there's so much that I could expand on all these subjects. But just let me just finish out what I have written here. I have I'm going to talk about what a mix, what considerations go into the mix. We talked about our neighborhoods, so our frequencies have to be considered and balanced out right. We talked about the amplitude, the volume, things being louder versus others. You mentioned a nice place to start with gain staging. We use, if you're doing dance music, if you're writing dance music, or most music these days have a low end element that's super heavy, so you use the kick drum as the anchor maybe, or in trap maybe the kick and the bass are kind of one and the same. You use those as an anchor element. You bring it down to maybe -10 on the DBFS scale and get that ready to be mixed with everything else. The tendency is to push things up. That's why we go so low. In the end, you'll end up a lot louder than that. So we deal with the frequencies. We deal with amplitude. We deal with psychoacoustics. So psychoacoustics, like we described the Haas effect earlier, or talked about the Haas effect earlier, the law of first wave front. There's like these laws of psychoacoustics, like if I am closer to you, like I am brighter because you'll hear every detail of all the high end. High end tends to dissipate with space. So if I'm farther away, I am less bright because that's just what happens in air. Low frequency having the most energy carries the farthest that way. If I am closer, I am less compressed. So if you think about your mixes and you're trying to make things come and feel like they're closer, well then make them less compressed, make them brighter. Farther away, more compressed, less bright. What that means is if I stand next to you and whisper to you and talk to you in your ear, you can hear all the details of my voice, the little, even the saliva moving around in my mouth and everything. You can hear all that stuff as I am closer. If I'm farther away, you could just, the air works as like a natural filter for these things and kind of compresses it all out and filters out the sound. If I'm closer, of course, I'm louder. If I'm farther away, I'm not as loud. And if I'm closer, I'm also less ambient. And by that I mean you can hear me and you know where the source is, and your ears are both getting the information kind of, when I'm standing in your face, you're hearing that at the same time. If I am standing across the room and I'm talking to you, as I am right now, you're going to hear my voice coming from here, but you're also going to hear the reflections coming from all sorts of the ceiling and your friends and all this stuff. And then it's going to get to your ears and it's going to be much more ambient than a directional thing that you're going to get if I'm right in your face, right? So these considerations go into setting up your mix. Then there's also playing with mid-side. Mid-side is one of those things in EQ that people don't even realize is there. So if you're looking at the EQ here, we have this mode, which is the mode that most of the time we're working in. But if we could switch it, most EQs, if they're worth their salt, have a mid-side mode. In the mid-side mode, anybody want to tell me what mid-side is? Yes?
Mid will just focus on the middle of the spectrum, side will focus on...
Middle of the spectrum, the frequency spectrum?
No, the low end, I mean. Sorry, I'm really tired.
I'm really nervous. Yeah.
The sound is here and center as well.
Here?
Side bands.
Side
Stereo.
bands. Okay, you guys sort of feel like you can.
It's just like the information shared by all speakers and the sides would be like what's different between speakers.
Did you ever come to my class? Because I use the word information all the time. Information, yes, it's information that's coming out of one speaker and not coming out of the other. That's what the sides are. That's what makes up stereo. So whatever comes out of this speaker that doesn't come out of that speaker, it would be considered to be on the sides. Whatever comes out of both speakers equally, no discrepancies, the same, then it feels like it's in the phantom center, right? And that is what you talk about when you talk about the mids. And a great thing to do in mid-side EQing, for example, on this track that we had playing here, was we had this, let's do this EQ here. Let's just take these guys out and let's keep it in side mode. And one of the things that is going to clear up things in an amazing way is to do what I'm about to do right now, which is to roll off all the low end that's on the sides. It looks like I should have no low end in this track, but it does. And why? Why is it still there? Well, I've just took out all the stereo low end. And why is that desirable? Yes?
Alright, so low end is not something you can easily perceive coming from any particular direction.
Mm-hmm.
It just sort of is something you feel. That's why like subwoofers you can kind of put wherever in a room as long as it sounds bad. Higher end does sound directional, so you care more about where it's coming from.
Okay, that's the preface to the answer.
Okay.
Now, what's the answer?
I think there are also the clubs, they don't do stereo lowers.
That's been a thing in clubs for many years. Yeah. And it's, for one thing, and we've talked about it before, it's phasing. And phasing could be a problem. So if you have subs that phase, that's the big disaster. Nothing is more disastrous in a mix than your subs phasing out. And suddenly the low end is gone. You can live with like a mid-frequency phase out, high frequency phase out. Those usually are smaller little bands. They're not like in the low end where it's gone. And when that happens, that's really a bad thing. So what we're trying to do is prevent that situation from ever happening. So we just just go at it and take out all the subs that are in stereo. And we just let, and there's plenty of stuff down there. I mean, there's an alternative to that. You don't have to like, take the sides out. You could just use one side of it. You could use it like a left and not use the both left and right, so just use it in mono. But regardless, you want sub to be not in stereo. Okay? Not in stereo. Stereo subs are a bad thing. Conversely, if you have high end that you want to well, let's say you want to enhance the stereo kind of enjoyment in the mix. One of the things you could do is shelve up the high sides, because everything that's in stereo will come out a little more. Come out a little more, and it'll feel like hyper stereo. It'll just be, or it doesn't have to be in the very highs. It could be somewhere in the mid highs or whatever. But just bring it all out. And if you got some bongos that are like, or congas that are recorded in stereo with two mics, and they're kind of just there, and you know that there's stereo information out there, but it's not really coming through. Well, let's keep the lows where they are, because you've got the volume kind of where we need them, and let's just take a shelf and shelve up the high end on that, and then bring them out. Bring out the stereo in it. So mid-side EQing is something that you need to be using on a daily. Yes?
There's these imagers, right? Like the ozone imager.
Mm-hmm.
Is that doing sort of the same thing when I go and I pick the bottom channel and make it mono? Or is that a different approach?
It's the same thing. So the imagers kind of make it a one-stop shop. So you're like ready to get what you need done in there. So the imager will let you, make it mono on the low end or any other band that you choose, and then expand or raise the sides on any of the other bands. And you have like four, and in that one particular one, you have 4 different bands that you could be working with. But it also has a little slider on the bottom that says stereoize. So that's another aspect of what the imager could do, and that's adding this Haas effect, basically changing the timing between left and right, so that left and right are a little bit different in time delivery. So you can go from like, let's say 1 millisecond to about 20 milliseconds before you notice that. Your brain just keeps on thinking it's bigger, it's bigger, it's bigger, it's bigger. And then about 23 milliseconds, the illusion collapses and you hear 2 sounds. Like, hey, I'm not fooled anymore. So yeah, that's part of what those imagers do. Actually, every imager does exactly that, which means that you can do it with all the stuff that's in DAWs these days. You could actually do all that imagers are doing, but the imagers are actually giving you a nice place to like just drop it in there and get it all done at once. So that's not a bad thing. All right, so I'm gonna just keep on taking questions if you guys would have them. I know you guys brought all your questions, so go for it. Yeah.
So if you're cutting, how narrow or wide are your cuts normally?
So with cuts, I think I told you the mantra is narrow cuts, wide boosts. And the reason you do narrow cuts is because it's easier to sense a hole in a mix when you cut it, or in a sound when you cut out a bigger hole. It just seems hollow, it seems empty, and it seems unnatural. You can do a narrow boost, that's okay, but you can get away with a wide boost because it doesn't seem hollow. It just feels like that certain frequency band got a little louder, and that's it. It's not as jarring as having a narrow boost. A narrow cut. So narrow cuts, wide boosts should be a good guideline for getting started with this. Yes?
What did you say earlier about the mids? What makes perfect mids?
What's that?
What makes perfect mids? You said that earlier.
Perfect mids?
Mids.
So, well, mids, once again, just to reiterate, when we talk about mids, we're talking about information that's coming exactly the same from these 2 speakers. So if it's the exact same information, what you're going to perceive it as being in the center, the phantom center, I like to call it. And that's what mids are really all about. Yeah, go ahead.
So the spectrum analyzer there.
Yeah.
I didn't understand. Okay, so from what I understand, the pitch goes from left to right, right? So you have your kick, your snare, and then I'm wondering, this decibel meter you said was the dB is up to down, and I just don't understand the
Okay, so the way you have is this x-axis, let's say this is the x-axis, this is going to be the frequency, so the note that's going to be played. Starting all the way down where you can't hear it, here's where you can, and going all the way up to where you wish you could hear it anymore. Okay, and this is the frequency. Kick drums would be around here, sub stuff, all the subs would be right around here. So generally under 100 or 90 hertz. So all in this area is the sub area. Then you get your, what you call your bass, which would be here. And you can break it down into whatever way makes sense to you, but you know, you start thinking that vocals can be around here, and you know, other elements, hi-hats are somewhere around here, you know. But then, you know, these elements like a snare, I said earlier, the snare carries in all parts of the frequency spectrum. So you take a snare, it'll be everywhere. You'll see frequencies everywhere.
So then you would do narrow cuts to get rid of the...
Well, this again is not the, it's just showing you what's there. You use an EQ to do the cutting or the boosting.
But that's what you would want to do, because the snare would be more prevalent and maybe you'd want to...
If it's what it needs, then you do that. It's dependent on what needs to happen. And then from here, going up, we have the DBFS scale. That's, you know, the scale that we use in digital. So it's full scale, and 0 being the highest it goes, and so we measure here. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, what's the rest of the order of operations? It starts with reductive EQ, and where do you go from there?
Well, there's like 4 kind of reductive EQs that you could think about. You could think about the reducing of the low frequencies that you don't need. Or if you're doing like hip hop and trap, this doesn't really apply, especially if you have very sparse low end, like or populated tracks. Then it goes to de-essing, so getting rid of the sibilants. Then there's getting rid of the subsides. And then the wonkiness, or the weird frequencies that appear. I would say look around 200 hertz and you start finding some. But they're all over the place, actually. You gotta search the whole spectrum for them. But around 200 hertz, and definitely between 100 and 4, you should be looking. And that's just the first part. Now, after that, you know, you can go into like what happens after that. Well, you know, in mastering, you think that there's like a mastering sort of frame, and at the end of the frame, you have a limiter, right? But everything in between, that really is, it's dependent on the situation. So I would say, just, you know, just throwing it out there, that I would probably do bus compression after I do EQ. So I do bus compression, you know, with a vintage compressor to kind of give that sonic hug, right? And then I start working with my harmonics and start seeing. I try to do the least possible additive EQ that you know that I can. The reductive EQ will go a long way. A lot of times people think that additive EQ is the fix where reductive EQ is, but when I am about to do additive EQ, I usually do it with a vintage equalizer. My favorites, my favorite number 1, Nathan, tell him my favorite number 1 EQ vintage equalizer.
Is it a Neve?
It is a Neve. Neve 1073. There's nothing better. Like the sweetness of that thing. You know, I judge a piece of gear or their plug-in equivalent, you know, counterpart as how many sweet spots does this thing have? And you know, every piece of gear, even the crappy one, will give you at least one sweet spot here or there. But the Neve 1073 is just all sweet spots everywhere you go. It's like a must-have. So I'm going to be grabbing a Neve 1073 probably, or if I need some real low-end experience, I probably grab a Pultec EQ, which does EQing while it compresses, so you can boost the low end and tighten it up with compressor at the same time. It's quite amazing, and adding all the juicy harmonics that you get with that, it's super cool. So after that, you know, I'll be looking at, you know, some way of exciting the track, maybe some tape. Now the tape could have come there, or it could have come before the EQ. It depends on how it's sounding. I'm switching things around all the time at this point. I'm just checking. Do I like this? Do I like this? Everything is valid at this point. It really is. It's just about what you're preferring and what's coming out. So then, you know, I'll go to to the Harmonics stuff, like tape. There's a plugin called the Sonics Inflator. It was created by Sony for their Oxford console. It's super amazing and super mysterious. It really is an incredible plugin and super easy to use. Yeah, anybody could use it. It's just you raise one level and now you inflated your track. And maybe you could see if you want to inflate the high end or the low end, and that's it. And it's usually just brings things out like, hello, I'm here. And it makes it louder without needing too much amplitude to make it that loudness. Of course, you'll increase some amplitude, but you know, comparatively speaking, raising it another way, there's no better way to make the things just bust out of the mix than the Sonics Inflators. So that will come into play, and then I'll start dropping other compressors in there to see what's happening. There's usually going to be a vintage limiter there, and my favorite vintage limiter is the Fairchild 670. This thing is like, so it's like 60 years old now or something like that, and you could like, if you wanted to buy one, you'd have to like find one first, and then you'd have to have like 50 grand to like pay for it. So it's kind of expensive. So the plugins are really good. And that gets me to like, not all plugins are made the same. I like using UAD plugins. They are pretty much top of the line. I have just been using UAD for the last couple of years. I didn't take the plunge into UAD until the last couple of years because there's some hardware that kind of separates you from there. You have to kind of get their hardware. Like I have to bring this box to be able to use my UAD plugins. But nothing sounds more like the real thing than UAD. And yeah. So more questions? Yes.
Do you use multiband compression and blend?
Multiband compression, yeah, sure. It's one of my go-to repair tools. It's kind of like, first aid a lot of the times, especially if I get a mix to master that is just so out of whack when it comes to the leveling and what things should be and how they should be sounding. I hope not to have to use multiband compression. That's the truth of it. If the mix is done right, you shouldn't be having to grab a multiband compressor. To me, it's really like I see mastering, what we call mastering, as a damage control. It's just a damage control experiment or experience for me. It is really just fixing all the problems, everything that went wrong. And if things are done correctly from the beginning, I don't end up needing, sadly I do use a multiband quite often on other people's mixes. On my own, I hopefully end up in a place that multiband isn't necessary because I've done everything I want to do to it in the mix. Questions? Yes?
So when you're producing, do you produce with your mastering chain on?
No. Please don't make that mistake. A lot of people do that. You know what that tends to do for you when you're producing to get your mastering chain on? It tends to get you going. It tends to motivate you. It tends to make you happy and make you really feel good about things. But it's kind of like drugs because it feels good at the moment, but at the moment that you take it off or later, you kind of pay for it. There's a down to that side because your decision-making process is going to be out of whack. So if you have like a limiter and all these other things on the master bus, and you're like doing all these other things to the mix in the meantime that sound right, you might make a move here, and it might not be exactly what your calibration in your brain about this device should be, and you'll be confused by the whole thing. I know it sounds better to use the a mastering chain or something like that while you're playing your music just to feel better about it, but you end up paying for it. You do end up kind of stealing your future happiness. That's what happens with drugs, right? So it's kind of the same. It really is the same. So I just leave it to the moment where it's time now to like, and then you get motivated, like, wow, look at this. It's even better than I ever thought it could ever be. It doesn't pay. It really doesn't. Yes?
Do you use sidechain compression?
Of course. But think about what I said earlier, that there are tools that are better at the job of side chaining or doing what the side chain compressor does than the actual compressor for side chaining. Well, what tools would that be? Well, there's like LFO tool or shaper box. Because a lot of times when people think about this ducking idea, right? So the idea that first came about was like, so you get a compressor and then you get, working on your, say, your bass. And then there's this kick drum. And the bass and the kick drum are competing. So now you put a compressor and you make the compressor crazy and you outsource the compressor's ears to listen to the kick. So when the kick goes up, the compressor compresses the bass. So you have the bass up here and the kick comes. When the kick goes up, the compressor gets out of the way. I mean, gets the kick out, the bass out of the way, like this. Okay, that's cool, that's ducking. That was like, grandpa's mixes, right? Now, this idea of side chaining, making it this, right? Where now you're writing a part with it, and you're making like a whole, you're making that, and you could blame that on like mid-90s French house when they discovered the Alesis 3630, which was the compressor that first allowed you to do the side chaining action. And this was great. I mean, to be able to do that when it was the only way to do that. But the truth is, with tools like ShaperBox and LFO tool, these are much more precise at doing exactly that. Even the ducking, even the simple ducking is easier to do. Any other questions? Yes.
When you go to the mix down, there's this whole thing of like, should you put the delay and the reverb on each track, or wait till the master mix down?
Well, once again, if you're doing the mix, it's hard. It's really kind of, we really have to talk for hours to like figure out what's going to happen in your case, because everybody's case is going to be very specific to their own workflow. If you're the producer and the writer and the only person that's going to treat this track, you might be doing all that stuff as you write. A long, long time ago, these things were kind of left to engineers. And what was the main reason? Well, the main reason is because the access didn't occur until you got into a big studio where the engineer would be there and be like, yeah, get your hands off it. And they were like only ones allowed to like touch these things, right? These days, you have all the access you want inside of these beautiful little silver boxes, and you could do that all on your own. So why not? Why not do it? Why not learn how to do it? And why not start at the beginning? It can certainly be a great part of your writing process. Yes?
Since we're talking about the process beginning with writing the music in the first place, are there things that one should be thinking about when recording elements that will help later on?
Well, just using the right microphone, for example, that makes a big deal, a big difference. A lot of people think they could do everything with one great microphone. I bought this AKG 414, which I think should be good for everything. It's a great mic, and it really can be used for a lot of different applications, but a lot of engineers that I know like to EQ with microphones, meaning they know what they're going to be recording, and they grab the right mic for the right situation, and they get it to sound amazing from the beginning. So kind of just doing that. Like Michael Jackson, right? You know what his favorite microphone was? The Shure SM7B, right? Why? That's not even a condenser mic. Right? It's a broadcast mic. You see those in podcasts all the time. It's because it's great for people with really loud voices that have kind of a thin tone to it, and it kind of thickens up their tone. So if you have a loud voice and you don't have a lot of bass in your voice, a Shure SM7B might be the answer for you. And so getting the right setup when you're recording is the answer to that question. Okay, one more thing I wanted to discuss briefly. How much time do we have?
You're good.
Okay.
All the time you need.
At the end of it all, we got to deal with our metering and understand that. Now, we don't have enough time to really discuss metering to the end, but there are so many aspects to figure out how loud your mix should be at the end of the whole process. For peak, meaning the loudest level possible inside your mix, the industry standard has been -0.3, right? And the RMS, meaning the stuff that hangs around most of the time, which contributes to your apparent loudness, that, you know, depends on who you are and what you're trying to do and how much dynamic range you want in your track. You can get that to -6, -8, or whatever. And this has been the thing to think about and talk about until like last week. Because now everybody's talking about LUFS. And that's all everybody's talking about. Anybody hear about this LUF stuff? Loudness units, full scale? It's a totally different way of measuring things that doesn't have to do with what, well, it has to do with sort of what you were looking at before, but now it's all about streaming. And streaming, it started with there was a Calm Act that came out sometime in the 80s, and it was about the commercial, I don't know, I forget what it stands for, but it was like, it was basically that you're watching a movie at home with your parents, and you're like, it's all dynamic, and it's quiet, and it's so scary, and you're like, and then the commercial comes and it blows you away, because it's so super loud, right? So they wanted to avoid that whole kind of discrepancy between super loud things and, you know, dynamic things. And because of that, YouTube started this first. They started to employ loudness normalization standards to their material. So you upload something on YouTube, it gets analyzed, and then it gets converted, and it gets looked at, and they use a measurement called LUFS now, which doesn't look at the absolute peak and the absolute RMS. It looks at everything across time. So time becomes a component. So it measures for at least 2.5 minutes of your recording, and then gives you an integrated kind of level that or a score that your mix has. And that, you know, then according to this score, they're either going to raise it or make it quiet. So that you could have an Elvis track compete with like a Skrillex track and have it not be, you know, have it be able to stream and not be jarring with discrepancy in the sound. That's the reason why now we're all looking at LUFS. So get into LUFS. I think that's all I have today. One more or two more questions maybe, and then we'll end it off. If not, then I could just go home.